Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, a quiet place where curiosity slows down a little, where science doesn't hurry, and where big questions are allowed to unfold gently, one idea at a time. Tonight's journey is about difference. Not the loud kind that demands attention, but the slow, subtle kind that takes tens of thousands of years to become visible. The kind that settles into bones, skin, habits, landscapes, and ways of living. We're going to explore why people who all belong to the same species, humans, ended up looking, living, and adapting so differently across two vast regions of the world, Europe and Asia. This isn't a story about superiority or separation. It isn't a tale of winners and losers or progress and backwardness. Instead, it's a long, patient explanation of how environments shape bodies, how climates guide cultures, and how time quietly leaves its fingerprints on everyone. The differences we see today didn't appear suddenly. They emerged slowly, almost invisibly, generation after generation, as humans adjusted to the places they lived and the challenges they faced. So before we get too far, take a moment to notice where you are right now. Where are you listening from tonight? What part of the world is holding you at this very moment? Is it late evening, early morning, or somewhere in between? There's something fitting about thinking about human variation while scattered across different time zones, climates, and landscapes. Even now, the same planet is offering very different conditions to different people, just as it always has. If you find this kind of slow, thoughtful exploration calming, or if it helps you unwind after a long day, you're very welcome to like the video or subscribe. It helps this quiet corner reach others who might appreciate a gentler way of learning, and if not, that's perfectly fine too. You can simply listen, let the ideas drift by, and take what you like. Now, let's ease into the question itself. Why did Europeans and Asians evolve so differently? It's a question that sounds simple on the surface, but it opens into something much larger once you start pulling on it. Because the truth is, they didn't evolve separately in the way people sometimes imagine. Humans didn't split into neat branches and head off in isolation. We remained the same species the entire time. We interbred, migrated, mixed, and moved repeatedly. The differences that emerged were gradual adjustments, not hard boundaries. To understand how this happened, we have to begin far earlier than Europe or Asia as we know them today. We have to go back to a time before borders, before languages, before agriculture, and before cities. A time when every human alive was part of a small mobile population, moving through landscapes that were far less predictable than the ones we live in now. Modern humans first evolved in Africa. That much is clear from genetics, fossils, and archaeology. For tens of thousands of years, all humans lived within Africa's varied environments, adapting to heat, seasonal rainfall, and diverse ecosystems. But eventually, some groups began to move outward. They followed coastlines, river systems, and animal herds. They moved not with a destination in mind, but because movement itself was part of survival. As humans left Africa, they didn't all go in the same direction, and they didn't all face the same conditions. Some groups moved into the Middle East and from there into Europe. Others continued eastward into South Asia, East Asia, and eventually into regions that would later connect to the Americas. These journeys weren't single events. They happened in waves, over thousands of years, with pauses, returns, and overlaps. Once humans spread out across Eurasia, the environments they encountered began to differ dramatically. Europe, especially during the Ice Age cycles, was shaped by cold temperatures, long winters, shorter growing seasons, and frequent glacial advances. Much of northern Europe was periodically covered in ice, forcing populations to retreat southward and then move north again when the ice receded. This constant push and pull created conditions where survival depended on cold tolerance, seasonal planning, and flexibility. Asia, on the other hand, was not one uniform environment. It was, and still is, enormous and varied. Northern Asia faced brutal colds similar to Europe, while East Asia experienced monsoon cycles, dense forests, and more stable seasonal patterns. South Asia dealt with heat, humidity, and predictable rainfall rhythms that shaped food production and settlement in different ways. These environmental differences mattered deeply because they influenced how people ate, moved, sheltered themselves, and organised their lives. Over long periods of time, even small differences in survival and reproduction can shift the traits of a population. If a particular body shape conserves heat better, or a certain skin tone allows more efficient vitamin production in low sunlight, or a specific immune response offers protection against local diseases, those traits slowly become more common. This is not a conscious process. No one chooses it. It's simply the result of who survives long enough to have children and whose children thrive. One of the most visible differences that emerge between populations living in Europe and those in parts of Asia involves skin pigmentation. This is often misunderstood, so it's worth slowing down here. Skin colour is not a marker of intelligence, worth, or ability. It is, at its core, an adaptation to ultraviolet radiation. In regions with low sunlight, lighter skin allows the body to produce enough vitamin D. In regions with high sunlight, darker skin protects against damage and nutrient loss. Europe, especially at higher latitudes, receives far less intense sunlight than regions closer to the equator. Over time, populations living there developed lighter skin tones as an adaptation to those conditions. In many parts of Asia, particularly East and Southeast Asia, sunlight levels were different, and seasonal patterns varied. This led to a range of skin tones shaped by local conditions rather than a single evolutionary direction. But physical traits are only part of the story, and focusing on them alone can be misleading. Equally important are the less visible differences, the ones inside the body and the brain. Metabolism, immune responses, and even tendencies toward uncertain physiological rhythms are influenced by long-term environmental pressures. Diet is a major example. In Europe, Ice Age conditions and later agricultural patterns favoured diets heavy in animal protein, dairy, and grains that could survive cooler climates. In many parts of Asia, especially East Asia, diets developed around rice cultivation, fish, legumes, and vegetables suited to wetter environments. Over thousands of years, these dietary patterns influenced digestion, enzyme production, and metabolic efficiency. A well-known example is lactose tolerance. In populations where dairy farming became common, particularly in parts of Europe, adults who could digest lactose had a nutritional advantage. Over time, lactose tolerance became more widespread. In regions where dairy was not a dietary staple, such as much of East Asia, there was no similar pressure, so lactose intolerance remained common. This isn't a flaw or deficiency, it's simply a reflection of different food histories. Climate also influenced body shape. Colder environments tend to favour more compact bodies that conserve heat, while warmer environments often favour leaner builds that dissipate heat more efficiently. These are broad trends, not rules, and there is enormous variation within every population. But across long spans of time, such pressures leave subtle statistical patterns. Movement and isolation played a role as well. Europe's geography, with its peninsulas, mountain ranges and shifting ice sheets, periodically isolated populations from one another. These periods of isolation allowed certain traits to become more pronounced within smaller groups. Asia, with its vast land mass and long-established trade routes, often allowed for more continuous gene flow across regions, even as cultural differences developed. Culture itself became a powerful force shaping human evolution. Once humans began to rely more heavily on learned behaviours rather than purely biological adaptations, the pace and direction of change shifted. Tools, clothing, shelter, and social organisation could buffer people against environmental pressures. This meant that cultural practices sometimes replaced biological adaptations, changing how evolution operated. In colder parts of Europe, tailored clothing, insulated shelters, and controlled use of fire reduced the need for extreme biological cold adaptations. In parts of Asia, complex agricultural systems and social coordination allowed large populations to thrive in environments that might otherwise have limited growth. Culture didn't stop evolution, but it redirected it. It's also important to remember that Europe and Asia were never sealed off from each other. There was constant movement across Eurasia. Traders, migrants, conquerors, and travellers carried genes, ideas, and technologies across vast distances. The Silk Road wasn't just a trade network for goods. It was a channel for human interaction that blurred boundaries long before modern globalization. This means that when we talk about Europeans and Asians evolving differently, we're not describing two cleanly separated stories. We're describing overlapping patterns shaped by geography, climate, and time. The differences we notice today are the cumulative result of many small adjustments, layered on top of one another. Humans did not diverge because of destiny or hierarchy. They adapted because they lived in different places under different conditions for a very long time. The planet shaped us, quietly and persistently, while we were busy surviving, raising children, and making sense of the world around us. When people talk about Europeans and Asians as if they are fundamentally different kinds of humans, it's usually because they're looking at the end result without considering the long road that led there. Strip away the labels, the maps, and the modern identities, and what you find underneath is something far simpler. Every human alive today belongs to the same species, not metaphorically, not loosely, but biologically, genetically, and unambiguously. Homo sapiens. One species with a shared origin, shared abilities, and a shared evolutionary toolkit. The idea that one species could produce so much visible variation can feel counterintuitive at first. We're used to thinking of evolution as something that creates new species over vast spans of time, not as something that subtly reshapes the same species while keeping it fully compatible. But that's exactly what happened with humans. The differences between populations in Europe and Asia emerged without ever crossing the line into speciation. No reproductive barriers formed. No genetic walls went up. People from these regions could always have children together, and those children were just as human as anyone else. To understand how that works, it helps to think of evolution not as a branching tree that splits cleanly into separate limbs, but more like a braided river. The water flows forward, but it divides and rejoins repeatedly. Some channels move faster, some slower, some pass through rocky terrain, others through flat plains, yet it's all the same river, carrying the same water toward the same sea. Human evolution outside Africa followed this kind of pattern. When early humans began moving out of Africa, they didn't do so as a single unified group. Small bands left at different times, following different routes, under different environmental pressures. Some paused for generations in one place before moving on. Others turned back or mixed with groups already living in new regions. This meant that from the very beginning, there was variation in who went where and when. Once population spread across Eurasia, distance itself became an important factor. When groups live closer together, genes move easily between them. When groups live farther apart, especially when separated by mountains, deserts, or ice sheets, gene flow slows down. This doesn't mean contact stops entirely, but it becomes less frequent. Over thousands of years, even modest reductions in gene flow can allow regional traits to become more noticeable. Still, it's important not to exaggerate this separation. Europe and Asia were never sealed worlds. There were always corridors of movement. The Eurasian landmass allowed people, animals, and ideas to travel across enormous distances, sometimes slowly, sometimes in bursts. Even during colder periods, refuges existed where populations survived and later expanded from. This constant movement prevented deep genetic isolation. What changed instead were the pressures acting on populations in different places. Evolution responds to pressures, not intentions. If a certain trait slightly improves survival or reproduction in one environment, but has no effect in another, it may become more common in the first place and remain rare in the second. Multiply this process by thousands of generations, and you begin to see patterns. Take temperature as an example. Cold environments place demands on the body that warm environments do not. Conserving heat becomes important. Producing enough energy becomes critical. In regions where winters were long and harsh, individuals with traits that supported heat retention, efficient fat storage, or seasonal planning were more likely to survive. In regions with more stable climates, different traits were favoured, such as heat dissipation or resilience to humidity. These are not dramatic, overnight changes. They are small statistical nudges. A slightly broader body retains heat better. A slightly narrower nose may warm cold air more efficiently. A particular fat distribution may provide an energy buffer during lean months. No single trait defines a population, and there is overlap everywhere. But when you average across large numbers of people over long periods, trends emerge. Diet added another layer. What people eat consistently over generations matters. In Europe, especially during Ice Age conditions, access to plant foods fluctuated seasonally. Large game animals provided calories, protein, and fat. Later, agriculture introduced grains and dairy. In many parts of Asia, especially East and Southeast Asia, reliable plant-based staples like rice became central, supplemented by fish and legumes. These dietary patterns shape digestion, metabolism, and even jaw structure over time. The human body is flexible, but it is not infinitely flexible. If a population consistently relies on certain foods, individuals who process those foods more efficiently have a slight advantage. Over generations, this can lead to differences in enzyme production, nutrient absorption, and gut microbiome composition. Again, these are tendencies, not absolutes. Plenty of Europeans are lactose intolerant. Plenty of Asians digest dairy just fine. But the statistical patterns reflect history. Disease pressures also differed. Pathogens thrive in specific environments. Dense forests, wetlands, and warm climates support different disease ecologies than cold, dry regions. Populations exposed to particular pathogens over long periods tend to develop immune responses that offer protection, either through genetic adaptations or through cultural practices that reduce exposure. These immune differences are often invisible, but can influence population health outcomes even today. Social organisation mattered too. Humans are intensely social, and social structure affects survival. In some environments, cooperation in large groups provided advantages. In others, mobility and smaller group sizes were more effective. These differences influenced settlement patterns, family structures, and cultural norms, which in turn shaped how resources were shared and how children were raised. It's tempting to separate biology and culture into neat boxes, but in human evolution they're deeply intertwined. Culture can reduce or redirect biological pressures. Clothing reduces exposure to cold. Cooking changes the nutritional value of food. Shelter alters how bodies interact with the environment. Once these cultural tools become reliable, biological selection shifts. Traits that would have been critical in a purely biological context become less important, while others gain significance. This is one reason why human evolution didn't follow a single predictable path. Different populations developed different cultural solutions to environmental challenges, and those solutions interacted with biology in complex ways. In Europe, repeated cycles of glaciation forced populations to adapt to instability. Retreat, survival in refuges, and re-expansion became part of the evolutionary story. In large parts of Asia, especially East Asia, longer-term stability allowed for sustained agricultural development and denser populations. Population size itself influences evolution. Larger populations maintain more genetic diversity. Smaller populations experience stronger effects from genetic drift, where chance plays a bigger role in which traits become common. Europe's fluctuating population sizes during ice ages may have amplified certain traits simply through repeated bottlenecks. Asia's larger and more continuous populations in some regions maintained broader variation. None of this implies directionality or hierarchy. Evolution does not aim toward improvement. It responds to circumstances. A trait that is advantageous in one setting may be neutral or even disadvantageous in another. There is no global scale by which adaptations are ranked. They are context-dependent solutions to local problems. Another important point is time depth. Many of the differences we notice today are relatively recent in evolutionary terms. Skin pigmentation changes occurred within tens of thousands of years. Lactase persistence spread within the last 10,000 years. Agricultural adaptations are younger still. This means that much of human variation developed after populations were already fully modern humans, not during some distant primitive phase. This also means that modern humans retain an extraordinary amount of shared genetic material. The genetic differences between any two humans are tiny compared to the similarities. In fact, genetic variation within so-called racial groups is often greater than variation between them. The categories people use in everyday language do not map neatly onto biology. When people say Europeans and Asians evolved differently, what they usually mean is that certain traits became more common in one region than another. That's a far cry from saying they became fundamentally different kinds of humans. The underlying blueprint remained the same. The differences are variations on a shared theme, not separate compositions. It's also worth remembering that evolution didn't stop once these patterns emerged. Migration, trade, conquest, and globalization have continued to mix populations. The modern world is reshaping human variation in new ways, often faster than biological evolution can respond. Cultural exchange now outpaces genetic divergence, blending paths that once diverged slightly. Humans did not split into separate evolutionary stories. We followed many paths at once, always connected, always capable of coming back together. One species, adapting in many ways across a world that offered many different challenges and many different ways to meet them. When humans finally began moving beyond Africa in lasting numbers, the world they stepped into was not empty, simple, or welcoming. It was vast, unpredictable, and already shaped by forces far older than humanity itself. This matters because evolution does not happen in a vacuum. It happens inside real landscapes, under real skies, shaped by temperature, terrain, plants, animals, and seasons. Once humans left Africa, those shaping forces multiplied, and from that moment on, no two journeys were quite the same. The first thing to understand is that leaving Africa was not a single event. It did not happen once with one group heading confidently toward a known destination. It happened many times, in pulses, over tens of thousands of years. Some groups moved out and disappeared. Others moved out and survived. Some settled for long periods near the edges of Africa, in places like the Levant, before moving farther. Each wave carried slightly different genetic combinations, experiences, and cultural habits. Africa itself is enormous and diverse, but the environments beyond it introduced extremes that early humans had never encountered before. As groups crossed into the Middle East and beyond, they faced colder winters, more dramatic seasonal shifts, unfamiliar predators, and entirely new plant and animal communities. These conditions did not immediately change human biology, but they changed behaviour, and behaviour is often the first step toward long-term adaptation. One of the most important changes involves seasonality. In much of Africa, while conditions vary, food availability does not collapse completely for long stretches of the year. Outside Africa, particularly at higher latitudes, seasons became sharper. Winters could mean months of scarcity. Plants died back. Animals migrated or became harder to find. Survival now required planning, storage, and coordination over longer time frames. This pressure favoured humans who could anticipate the future. Those who remembered seasonal patterns, who planned hunts, who shared resources, and who maintained social bonds during hard periods were more likely to survive. Over time, this strengthened the role of culture, memory, and cooperation as survival tools. Biology supported these traits, but culture carried much of the weight. As humans spread across Eurasia, geography began to funnel populations along certain routes. Mountain ranges like the Caucasus and the Himalayas, deserts like the Arabian and Central Asian deserts, and bodies of water like the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean all shaped movement. These barriers did not completely block migration, but they slowed it, redirected it, and sometimes isolated groups for long periods. Europe in particular was strongly shaped by ice. During glacial periods, massive ice sheets covered much of northern Europe. Habitable land shrank, pushing populations southward into refuges in places like the Iberian Peninsula, the Italian Peninsula, and the Balkans. When the ice retreated, humans moved north again. This repeated contraction and expansion created population bottlenecks, where only small groups survived and repopulated large areas. These bottlenecks mattered because they amplified chance. Traits present in the surviving populations became disproportionately common, not necessarily because they were superior, but because they were the ones carried forward. Over repeated cycles, this process could shape the genetic makeup of entire regions. Asia's story unfolded differently. While Northern Asia also experienced extreme cold, large parts of East and Southeast Asia remained more climatically stable. Monsoon systems brought predictable rainfall. Forests and river systems supported continuous human habitation. This stability allowed populations to grow larger and remain more connected over time. Larger populations maintain more genetic diversity. They are less affected by random fluctuations and bottlenecks. This meant that in many parts of Asia, evolutionary change was influenced more by gradual selection pressures than by dramatic population resets. The result was not uniformity, but continuity. Another critical factor was the presence of other human species. When modern humans left Africa, they were not alone in the world. Neanderthals lived across Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans occupied parts of Eastern Asia. These groups had been adapting to Eurasian environments for hundreds of thousands of years. They were not primitive versions of us. They were humans with their own histories. As modern humans spread, they encountered and interbred with these populations. Genetic evidence shows that many people today carry small percentages of Neanderthal or Denisovan DNA. These contributions were not evenly distributed. Europeans tend to carry more Neanderthal ancestry, while some Asian populations carry both Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry. This admixture mattered because it introduced genes already adapted to local conditions. Some of these genes are linked to immune responses, skin biology, and even altitude adaptation. This was not a takeover or replacement, it was integration. Modern humans absorbed useful genetic variants from populations who had already learned, biologically, how to survive outside Africa. Once humans were established across Eurasia, the environments continued to push in different directions. In Europe, repeated exposure to cold selected for traits related to heat retention and energy storage. In East Asia, humidity, forested landscapes, and dense vegetation shaped different hunting strategies and settlement patterns. In South Asia, heat and seasonal rainfall shaped food production and social organisation. Food availability was one of the most powerful shaping forces. Outside Africa, diets diversified dramatically. Coastal populations relied heavily on fish and shellfish. Inland groups hunted large herbivores or gathered seasonal plants. River valleys supported dense populations once agriculture emerged. These dietary differences affected not only nutrition, but growth patterns, jaw development, and metabolism. The use of fire and cooking became increasingly important. Cooking increases the energy available from food and reduces the digestive burden. This allowed humans to support larger brains and longer developmental periods. But cooking also tied humans to fuel availability and settlement choices, reinforcing regional differences in daily life. Clothing and shelter also became essential outside Africa. In colder regions, survival depended on insulation. This encouraged the development of tailored clothing, complex shelters, and controlled fire use. These cultural innovations reduced direct biological pressure, allowing humans to survive conditions that would otherwise have been lethal. However, reducing one pressure often introduces another. Reliance on shelter and clothing increases vulnerability to resource shortages. If materials are unavailable or social systems break down, survival becomes harder. This reinforced the importance of social cooperation, shared knowledge, and group cohesion. Time depth is crucial here. None of these adaptations happened quickly. Tens of thousands of years passed as humans adjusted incrementally to their surroundings. During this time, populations continued to move, mix, and change. Europe and Asia were not static backdrops. Rivers shifted, forests expanded and contracted, coastlines moved, and climates oscillated. The Ice Age cycles alone reshaped Eurasia repeatedly. Glacial advances altered sea levels, exposing land bridges like Beringia, and connecting regions that are now separated. These connections allowed humans to move into new territories, carrying adaptations shaped elsewhere. When sea levels rose again, populations were isolated, preserving regional traits. Disease landscapes also differed. As humans settled more permanently, especially with the rise of agriculture, infectious diseases became more common. Dense populations and close contact with domesticated animals created new disease pressures. Immune systems adapted locally, influenced by which pathogens were most common in a given environment. This is another reason why populations diverge subtly. A gene that offers resistance to a specific disease may become common in one region and rare in another. These differences are often invisible, but can have lasting effects on health patterns. Importantly, none of this created rigid categories. There was always overlap. There were always exceptions. Evolution works on populations, not individuals. It shifts averages, not destinies. The world after Africa did not carve humanity into separate types. It nudged different groups along slightly different trajectories while keeping them fully human and fully compatible. Once humans were fully established beyond Africa, the landscapes themselves became quiet but constant forces shaping daily life. Not in dramatic, cinematic ways, but through small, repeated demands placed on the body and mind. Ice, forests, and open grasslands were not just scenery. They determined what people ate, how far they travelled, how they built shelter, how they cooperated, and even how they thought about time and risk. Over many thousands of years, these environments didn't just host human life, they actively guided it. Ice was perhaps the most unforgiving of these forces. Large parts of Europe and northern Asia were repeatedly reshaped by glacial cycles. During colder periods, ice sheets expanded, covering vast regions with thick, immobile glaciers. These were not places humans could adapt to directly. Instead, ice acted as a moving wall, compressing habitable land and forcing populations into smaller, more crowded refuges farther south. Life in these refuges was possible, but never easy. In these cold-dominated regions, survival depended on anticipating scarcity. Winters were long and harsh. Food availability dropped sharply for months at a time. Plants were unavailable. Animals migrated, hibernated, or became difficult to hunt. Humans who survived in these conditions relied heavily on stored resources, cooperative hunting, and shared knowledge passed down across generations. A failed season could mean disaster, so redundancy and planning mattered. Cold environments also imposed physical constraints. Maintaining body heat required energy. Individuals with body shapes that conserved heat more efficiently had a slight advantage, especially in childhood. Over long periods, populations in colder regions tended toward more compact builds, shorter extremities relative to torso size, and metabolic patterns that favoured heat retention. These were not conscious adaptations. They were statistical outcomes across many generations. Clothing became essential. In warm climates, minimal covering is sufficient. In icy regions, tailored clothing made from animal hides and furs became a matter of survival. This required skills, tools, and cooperation. Hunting large animals for hides, processing them, sewing fitted garments, and repairing them demanded time and knowledge. This pushed human societies toward more complex cultural systems, where survival depended as much on shared skills as on individual strength. Fire use also intensified. Fire was no longer just a tool for cooking or protection. It became central to warmth, light, and survival during long, dark winters. Maintaining fire through cold seasons required fuel management, shelter construction, and social coordination. Losing fire could be fatal. This dependence reinforced social bonds because firekeeping was rarely a solitary task. While ice constrained movement, it also created patterns of mobility. Glacial advances forced humans to retreat. Glacial retreats opened new land. This led to cycles of contraction and expansion. Populations that survived in southern refuges later moved north again, recolonizing areas as ice melted. Each cycle filtered populations, amplifying certain traits simply through survival and chance. Forests presented a different set of challenges. Much of East Asia and parts of Europe were dominated by dense woodlands rather than open terrain. Forests limit visibility. They complicate long-distance hunting. Large herd animals are less predictable in dense vegetation. Instead, forest environments favour smaller game, plant gathering, fishing, and ambush strategies. Living in forest requires detailed environmental knowledge, knowing when plants fruit, where animals travel, and how seasons affect forest ecology becomes critical. This kind of knowledge is learned, shared, and refined over generations. It favours memory, observation, and teaching. Forest environments reward patience and adaptability rather than raw speed or endurance. Movement through forests is slower and more constrained. This influences settlement patterns. Groups may remain within familiar territories longer, developing deep knowledge of specific areas. This can lead to more stable local populations and less frequent long-distance migration compared to open grasslands. Over time, this stability allows cultural traditions to deepen and diversify. Forests also influence diet. Plant diversity is often higher, but caloric density can be lower than that provided by large herd animals. This pushes populations toward mixed subsistence strategies. Fishing, trapping, gathering, and small-scale hunting all contribute. Diets become varied, but require careful balance. This can shape digestion and metabolism subtly over time. In humid forest environments, disease pressure tends to be higher. Warmth and moisture support parasites and pathogens. Populations living in such conditions faced ongoing immune challenges. Over long periods, immune system adaptations that improved resistance to local diseases offered survival advantages. These changes are often invisible externally, but significant internally. Open grasslands, by contrast, presented yet another evolutionary context. Grasslands stretch far into the distance. Visibility is high. Herd animals dominate. Movement across open terrain is faster, but more exposed. Survival in grasslands often depends on endurance, coordination, and the ability to track animals over long distances. Grassland hunting favours cooperation. Bringing down large animals usually requires group effort, planning, and communication. This reinforces social structures and shared strategies. It also rewards stamina and thermoregulation. Long-distance travel under open skies exposes individuals to heat, cold, wind, and sun. Managing these stresses shapes physiology and behaviour. Grasslands also facilitate migration. With fewer natural barriers, populations can move more easily across large areas. This encourages gene flow between groups, reducing isolation. In parts of Asia, expansive grasslands allowed continuous movement across regions, maintaining genetic connectivity even as cultures diversified. However, grasslands are also unpredictable. Rainfall can vary dramatically. Droughts can devastate herds. Successful grassland societies needed flexibility. They had to shift routes, adjust diets, and respond quickly to environmental change. This selected for behavioural adaptability and social coordination. The contrast between these environments mattered because Europe and Asia contained different proportions of each. Europe's repeated glaciation compressed populations into forested and coastal refuges, then released them into newly opened land. Asia, especially East Asia, combined forests, river systems and grasslands in ways that allowed more continuous habitation. These environmental patterns influenced not just bodies, but social rhythms. In icy regions, life was structured around seasons of scarcity and abundance. In forested regions, life followed ecological cycles of plants and animals. In grasslands, life revolved around movement and tracking. Over generations, these rhythms shaped daily routines, social expectations, and even concepts of time and planning. It's important to stress that no population lived in only one environment forever. Humans moved between forests and grasslands, between cold and temperate zones. But the dominant pressures of a region left lasting impressions. Adaptations accumulated gradually, reinforced by repeated exposure to similar challenges. These environments also shaped how children grew up. Childhood conditions matter enormously in evolution. Nutrition, disease exposure, physical activity and social learning all influence development. A child raised in a cold, resource-scarce environment experiences different pressures than one raised in a warm, resource-diverse forest or an open grassland with frequent movement. These differences compound across generations. Over time, the interaction between ice, forests, and grasslands helped guide populations along slightly different paths, not towards separate destinies, but toward locally effective solutions. Bodies, behaviours, and cultures adjusted in quiet ways that only become visible when viewed across thousands of years. Climate does not act quickly, and it does not announce itself while it works. It presses gently, season after season, year after year, generation after generation. When humans spread across Europe and Asia, climate became one of the most consistent forces shaping how life unfolded. Not as a dramatic event, but as a steady background influence that quietly rewarded some traits, discouraged others, and reshaped daily survival in ways that accumulated over immense spans of time. The climates humans encountered outside Africa were far more variable than those of their ancestral homeland. Temperature swings were wider, seasons were more sharply defined. Rainfall patterns could be predictable in one region and wildly unstable in another. These differences mattered because human bodies are sensitive systems. Small changes in temperature, light exposure, and food availability can affect growth, reproduction, and survival. Over long periods, those effects add up. In Europe, climate instability was a defining feature. Ice ages came and went repeatedly over the last several 100,000 years. During colder phases, average temperatures dropped significantly. Glaciers advanced, sea levels fell, and ecosystems shifted southward. During warmer interglacial periods, ice retreated, forests expanded, and coastlines moved again. Human populations living in Europe had to endure this constant environmental rearrangement. This instability favoured flexibility above all else. Groups that could shift their behaviour, diets, and settlement patterns survived. Those that were too specialised often disappeared. Over time, this selected for populations that were behaviourally adaptable, socially cooperative, and capable of planning for uncertain futures. Climate uncertainty does not reward rigid strategies. Cold periods impose severe energetic demands. Maintaining body temperature requires calories. In cold climates, humans burn more energy simply staying warm. Individuals with metabolisms that could support higher energy demands, especially during childhood, had a survival advantage. Over generations, this contributed to differences in body composition and energy regulation between populations exposed to prolonged cold and those living in more stable climates. Day length also played a role. At higher latitudes, seasonal changes in daylight are extreme. Summers bring long days, winters bring long nights. These light cycles affect sleep patterns, hormone regulation, and mood. Humans living under such conditions had to synchronize their biological rhythms to dramatic seasonal changes. This placed pressure on circadian regulation, influencing sleep timing, activity levels, and seasonal behavior. In contrast, much of East and Southeast Asia experienced climates dominated by monsoon systems. Rather than extreme cold, the main challenge was managing cycles of heavy rainfall and humidity. Monsoons bring predictable wet seasons followed by dry periods. While this creates reliable agricultural opportunities, it also introduces risks like flooding, crop failure, and disease outbreaks. Populations living under monsoon climates benefited from traits that supported heat tolerance, efficient cooling, and resistance to humidity-related pathogens. Managing body temperature in warm, moist conditions requires different physiological strategies than conserving heat in cold ones. Sweating efficiency, skin blood flow, and hydration regulation become important. Climate stability also matters. Regions with relatively stable climates allow populations to settle, grow, and develop long-term cultural traditions. East Asia, particularly river valley regions, offered such stability for extended periods. This encouraged the development of agriculture, permanent settlements, and dense populations. Larger populations maintain more genetic diversity and experience slower genetic drift, which affects how traits spread. Europe's repeated climate disruptions, by contrast, caused population contractions and expansions. During glacial maxima, habitable land shrank dramatically. Populations retreated into southern refuges. When climates warmed, they expanded northward again. Each contraction reduced population size. Each expansion amplified the traits present in the survivors. Over multiple cycles, this process left lasting imprints. Rainfall patterns also shaped adaptation. In some regions, rainfall was scarce and unpredictable. In others, it was abundant but seasonal. Managing water availability influenced settlement locations, food storage practices, and social cooperation. Groups that coordinated irrigation, shared resources, and managed risk collectively had better survival outcomes. Climate also influenced disease landscapes. Cold, dry climates suppress many pathogens. Warm, wet climates support them. As a result, populations in different regions faced very different disease pressures. Immune systems adapted locally, favouring genetic variants that improve resistance to prevalent infections. These adaptations often involve trade-offs, offering protection against one disease while increasing susceptibility to another. Skin biology reflects climate pressures clearly. Sunlight exposure varies with latitude, cloud cover, and season. Ultraviolet radiation affects vitamin D synthesis, DNA damage, and immune function. In low UV environments, lighter skin improves vitamin D production. In high UV environments, darker skin protects against damage and nutrient loss. These changes occurred gradually and independently in different regions. Climate also shaped childhood development. Growth patterns are sensitive to nutrition, disease, and temperature. Children growing up in cold environments with seasonal scarcity faced different challenges than those in warm environments with year-round food availability. These conditions influenced growth rates, maturation timing, and overall body size distributions over generations. Behavioral adaptations were just as important. In cold climates, storing food became essential. This encouraged foresight, tool development, and social rules around sharing and ownership. In warmer climates, continuous foraging or farming reduced the need for long-term storage, but increased exposure to pests and disease, shaping different social strategies. Clothing and shelter technologies interacted with climate continuously. In cold regions, insulating clothing reduced selective pressure on biological cold tolerance, but only as long as materials and knowledge were available. In warmer regions, lightweight clothing and ventilation mattered more. These cultural solutions changed how climate pressures acted on biology, redirecting rather than eliminating them. Climate also affected mobility. Harsh winters limited travel. Monsoon rains could isolate regions for months. These constraints influenced gene flow between populations. Periods of isolation allowed regional traits to accumulate. Periods of connectivity reintroduced mixing. This ebb and flow prevented extreme divergence while still allowing differentiation. Long-term climate trends mattered too. Over tens of thousands of years, Earth gradually moved out of the last ice age. Warmer conditions allowed agriculture to emerge independently in multiple regions. Farming transformed human life, diets changed, workloads shifted. Disease exposure increased, population densities rose. These changes introduced new selection pressures that interacted with older climate-driven adaptations. Agriculture tied humans more closely to local climates. Crop success depended on rainfall timing, temperature ranges, and soil conditions. In Europe, shorter growing seasons shaped crop choices and labour organisation. In East Asia, rice cultivation thrived under monsoon conditions, but required intense coordination and water management. These agricultural systems influenced social structure, labour division, and daily routines. Climate did not act alone. It worked alongside geography, culture, and chance. But its influence was persistent. Every winter survived, every drought endured, every flood navigated, reinforced certain traits and behaviours. Over thousands of years, climate became a sculptor, not by carving sharply, but by wearing surfaces down gradually until patterns emerged. Importantly, climate-driven adaptation never produced uniform outcomes. Variation persisted within every population. Individuals responded differently. Migration reintroduced diversity. Culture buffered biological pressures. Evolution followed many overlapping paths at once. Food and fire sit at the centre of human survival in a way few other factors do. Long before written language, before settled cities, before borders or identities, daily life revolved around the question of what could be eaten, how it could be prepared, and how long it would last. Once humans spread across Europe and Asia, these questions took on very different answers, depending on where people lived, what environments offered, and how predictable those offerings were. Over thousands of years, the combined pressures of diet and cooking shaped bodies, behaviours, and social systems in ways that quietly but powerfully influenced how populations diverged. Food availability outside Africa was uneven and often seasonal. In many regions of Europe, edible plant foods were abundant only during certain parts of the year. Winters sharply reduced access to fruits, nuts, and fresh vegetation. For long stretches, calories came primarily from animal sources. Hunting large mammals provided meat, fat, and marrow, all dense sources of energy. This diet supported survival in cold conditions, but it required skill, coordination, and risk-taking. Large animals were dangerous, unpredictable, and not always available. Hunting success depended on cooperation. Bringing down a large animal usually required multiple individuals working together, communicating effectively, and trusting one another. This reinforced social bonds and favoured groups that could coordinate well under pressure. Sharing food was not optional. A successful hunt often produced more meat than a single family could consume before spoilage, especially before advanced preservation techniques. Social rules around sharing reduced waste and increased group survival. Fat played a particularly important role. In cold environments, fat is not just a nutrient, it is fuel for warmth. Populations that relied heavily on animal fat developed metabolic patterns suited to processing high-fat diets efficiently. Over generations, this influenced energy storage, cholesterol regulation, and even hunger signalling. These changes were subtle but cumulative. fire made this lifestyle possible. Cooking transforms food. It breaks down fibers, denatures proteins, kills parasites, and increases the amount of energy the body can extract. For humans living in colder climates, cooking meat and fat improved digestion and reduced the energy cost of eating. Fire also allowed humans to access foods that would otherwise be difficult or dangerous to consume. Maintaining fire in cold regions was a constant concern. Firewood had to be gathered, dried, and protected from moisture. Hearths had to be tended. Fire could not be allowed to go out during winter months. This dependency reinforced settlement patterns. Even mobile groups often returned to familiar camps where fuel sources were reliable. Knowledge about fire management became essential and was passed down carefully. In contrast, many parts of Asia, especially East and Southeast Asia, offered more consistent access to plant-based foods. Rice, millet, legumes and vegetables could be cultivated or gathered reliably under monsoon conditions. Fish and aquatic resources provided protein without the risks associated with large game hunting. Diets in these regions tended to be more varied but often lower in fat. These dietary patterns shaped digestion differently. Carbohydrate-heavy diets favoured different enzyme profiles and metabolic responses than fat-heavy ones. Over time, populations adapted to process their primary food sources efficiently. These adaptations did not make one diet superior to another. They simply reflected what was locally available and reliable. Fire still played a crucial role, but in different ways. In warmer climates, fire was less about survival against cold and more about cooking, pest control and social gathering. Cooking plant foods like rice increases digestibility and reduces toxins. Steaming, boiling and fermenting became common techniques, each shaping food texture, nutrient availability and microbial exposure. Fermentation deserves special attention. In many Asian cultures, fermentation became a central food processing strategy. Fermented foods preserve nutrients, enhance flavour, and support beneficial gut bacteria. Regular consumption of fermented foods influences the gut microbiome, which in turn affects digestion, immunity, and even mood. Over generations, this created feedback loops between diet, health, and cultural preference. Daily survival also depended on how food was obtained, not just what it was. Farming, foraging, fishing, and hunting place different demands on the body. Farming requires repetitive labour, bending, lifting and endurance over long periods. Hunting demands bursts of strength, coordination and risk tolerance. Fishing requires patience, timing and environmental knowledge. These activities shaped musculoskeletal development and injury patterns. Children growing up in these environments adapted accordingly. Childhood nutrition influences growth trajectories. Diets rich in protein and fat support different growth patterns than diets rich in carbohydrates and plant proteins. Disease exposure also interacts with nutrition. In warmer, wetter climates, children faced higher pathogen loads, which can divert energy away from growth. Over generations, these pressures influenced average body size and proportions. Food storage practices mattered as well. In colder climates, storing food for winter was essential. Drying meat, rendering fat, and preserving roots required planning and cooperation. This favoured cognitive skills related to foresight, memory, and rule enforcement. In regions with year-round food availability, storage was less critical, though still useful during lean periods. This allowed for different rhythms of work and rest. Fire also shaped social life. The hearth became a focal point. It provided warmth, light, and a place to gather. Stories were told around fire, skills were taught, social norms were reinforced. This may seem cultural rather than biological, but social stability affects survival and reproduction. Groups with strong cohesion are better able to support vulnerable members, including children and the elderly. Fire altered sleep patterns as well. Artificial light extends waking hours. In colder regions, long winter nights would have been oppressive without fire. Firelight allowed activity, socialization, and tool-making after sunset. This changed daily schedules and potentially influenced circadian rhythms over long periods. The interaction between food and fire also affected health. Cooking reduces exposure to pathogens, but smoke inhalation introduces respiratory stress. In enclosed shelters, smoke exposure could be significant. Over time, this may have influenced respiratory physiology and tolerance to particulate matter. As agriculture spread, the relationship between food and survival shifted again. In Europe, farming introduced grains and dairy as staples. This changed diets dramatically. Carbohydrate intake increased. Dental wear patterns changed. Nutrient deficiencies became more common during crop failures. However, agriculture supported larger populations and more stable food supplies overall. In East Asia, rice cultivation became dominant. Rice farming is labour-intensive and requires precise water management. It encourages cooperative labour and tight social coordination. The physical demands of rice farming shaped daily movement patterns and work rhythms. Diets centred on rice are high in carbohydrates but relatively low in fat, influencing energy metabolism differently than meat-heavy diets. Fire-supported agriculture through land clearing, cooking and pest management. Burning fields resets soil nutrients and controls vegetation. Cooking grains makes them digestible. These practices tied humans more closely to their environments and increased reliance on specific landscapes. Importantly, cultural practices around food can evolve faster than biology. When diets change rapidly, biological systems may lag behind. This mismatch can influence health outcomes. For example, populations adapted to certain traditional diets may experience increased disease risk when those diets change suddenly. This highlights how deeply historical food patterns are embedded in physiology. Despite these differences, it's essential to remember that humans remained flexible. Migration reintroduced dietary diversity. Trade spread food technologies. Cultural exchange blended cooking methods. Over time, boundaries softened. The differences shaped by food and fire did not lock populations into fixed identities. They created tendencies, not limits. Daily survival was always about balance, balancing energy intake and expenditure, balancing risk and reward, balancing cooperation and competition. Food and fire sat at the centre of that balance, quietly guiding evolution without ever dictating it. Movement is one of the defining traits of our species. Humans are not built to stay still indefinitely. From the earliest days of our existence, survival depended on the ability to walk long distances, to follow resources, to relocate when conditions changed, and to explore unfamiliar territory. Once humans spread across Europe and Asia, patterns of movement, distance travelled, and periods of isolation became powerful forces shaping how populations gradually diverged, not by design, but by circumstance. At its core, movement determines connection. Groups that move often and widely encounter other groups more frequently. They exchange ideas, tools, customs, and genes. Groups that move less, or that are hemmed in by geography, encounter fewer outsiders. Over long periods, this difference alone can create noticeable variation, even when the underlying biology remains shared. Isolation does not require walls, it only requires distance, difficulty, or risk. The geography of Eurasia created very different movement landscapes. Europe, despite being smaller than Asia, is deeply fragmented. Mountain ranges like the Alps, Pyrenees, and Carpathians divide regions sharply. Peninsulas extend into surrounding seas. Rivers run in ways that both connect and separate. During Ice Age periods, glaciers further restricted movement, closing off large areas entirely. Travel was possible, but it was often slow, seasonal, and dangerous. Asia, by contrast, is vast and varied, but in many places more continuous. Broad plains stretch across Central Asia. Long river systems connect interior regions to coasts. While formidable barriers exist, such as the Himalayas and large deserts, There are also wide corridors that allow movement over enormous distances. These corridors supported migration, trade, and gene flow long before recorded history. In colder parts of Europe, movement was often dictated by climate. During glacial advances, populations retreated southward. When ice receded, they moved north again. These migrations were not smooth. They occurred in stages with pauses that could last generations. Each pause created opportunities for local adaptation and drift. Each movement reshuffled populations, but not evenly. Repeated contractions into refuges are especially important. When populations shrink and cluster into limited areas, genetic diversity decreases. Traits carried by survivors become more prominent, not necessarily because they are advantageous, but because alternatives are lost. When these populations expand again, they carry a filtered genetic profile with them. Over multiple cycles, this process leaves regional signatures. Asia experienced fewer large-scale population compressions in many regions, particularly East and Southeast Asia. While climate shifts certainly occurred, they often did not force complete abandonment of vast areas. This allowed populations to remain larger and more continuously connected. Larger populations dilute the effects of chance and maintain broader variation. Distance itself matters even without barriers. Humans tend to move within familiar ranges. Long-distance travel is costly in energy, risk, and time. As a result, gene flow decreases gradually with distance. This creates clines, gradual changes in traits across geography, rather than sharp boundaries. Over thousands of kilometers, these gradual shifts can accumulate into noticeable differences. Isolation does not have to be absolute to have evolutionary effects. Even partial isolation, where contact is infrequent rather than absent, is enough. A village separated by a mountain range may see visitors once a year instead of once a month. Over generations, that difference adds up. Marriages occur mostly within the group. Local traits persist. External influences arrive slowly. Movement patterns also differed depending on subsistence strategies. Hunter-gatherers often moved seasonally, following food sources. Their movement ranges could be large, but they tended to revisit the same territories repeatedly. Agricultural societies moved less but supported larger populations in fixed locations. This reduced long-distance movement for most individuals while increasing local density. In Europe, the shift to agriculture occurred under conditions of shorter growing seasons and less predictable weather. Farming communities often clustered around fertile valleys and avoided marginal land. This created pockets of dense population separated by less hospitable terrain. These pockets could remain relatively isolated for long periods, reinforcing regional variation. In East Asia, especially along major river systems, agriculture supported continuous chains of settlements. Rivers acted as highways, facilitating movement and exchange. Boats allowed transport of goods and people more efficiently than overland travel. This connectivity helped maintain gene flow across wide areas, even as local cultures developed distinct identities. Trade routes played a major role in bridging distance. The Silk Road is the most famous example, but it was not a single road. It was a network of routes connecting East Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East and Europe. Along these routes, people moved not just goods, but ideas, technologies, religions, and genes. However, participation in these networks was uneven. Some regions lay at crossroads, others remained peripheral. Peripheral regions often experienced greater isolation. Mountain valleys, islands, and remote forests could support stable populations with limited external contact. In Europe, island populations and mountainous regions often show stronger genetic drift. In Asia, similar effects occurred in isolated highlands or deep interior regions. These pockets illustrate how isolation can arise even within otherwise connected continents. Movement is also shaped by social norms: who is allowed to travel, who marries whom, whether outsiders are welcomed or resisted. Cultural rules influence gene flow just as geography does. Some societies encouraged exogamy, marrying outside the group. Others favoured endogamy, marrying within it. Over time, these practices affect genetic structure. Conflict influences movement too. Warfare can displace populations, create barriers, or force mixing. In some cases, conquest leads to large-scale population replacement or integration. In others, it reinforces boundaries. Europe's history of frequent localized conflicts may have increased population turnover in some regions, while isolating others. Asia experienced both vast empires that connected regions and periods of fragmentation that restricted movement. Disease outbreaks also alter movement patterns. Epidemics can depopulate regions, creating gaps that later migrants fill. Survivors may be isolated temporarily, amplifying certain traits. Over long timescales, disease-driven population shifts contribute to regional differentiation. It's important to note that isolation does not imply stagnation. Isolated populations continue to innovate culturally. They adapt to local conditions creatively. However, biological variation can become more pronounced simply because fewer new genetic inputs arrive. Despite all these factors, Europe and Asia never became biologically separate worlds. There was always some level of connection. Even small amounts of gene flow are enough to prevent speciation. Humans remained one species, with differences shaped by gradients rather than walls. Movement also affects how quickly adaptations spread. A beneficial trait arising in one region can spread rapidly if populations are well connected. If movement is limited, the same trait may remain local. This helps explain why some adaptations, such as lactase persistence, became common in parts of Europe but rare elsewhere. The conditions that favoured it existed in multiple regions, but movement patterns determined how widely it spread. Children born into mobile societies experience different developmental pressures than those in sedentary ones. Frequent relocation demands physical resilience and social flexibility. Stable settlements allow deeper attachment to place and routine. These childhood experiences influence behaviour and stress responses, which can have long-term effects on health and reproduction. Isolation also affects language and culture, which in turn influence social structure. Distinct languages reduce intermarriage. Distinct customs shape identity. Over time, cultural boundaries reinforce biological patterns without requiring physical separation. As humans continue to move, settle, and occasionally isolate, these processes layered over one another. No single factor explains the differences that emerged. Movement, distance, and isolation work together, shaping how traits accumulated and spread. What becomes clear is that divergence did not require intention or ideology. It emerged from everyday decisions: where to settle, when to move, whom to marry, which routes to travel. These small choices, repeated across countless lives, gradually produced the patterns we now label as regional differences. When people notice differences between populations in Europe and Asia, they often focus first on faces and bodies. These are the most immediately visible features, and because they are visible, they are often misunderstood. Facial structure, body proportions, and external traits can seem fixed or defining, but in reality they are among the most responsive aspects of human biology. They change slowly, yes, but they change reliably in response to environment, diet, climate, and daily life. What we see today is not the result of sudden divergence or separate origins, but of many small adjustments layered over long periods of time. The human face is shaped by a combination of genetics, growth patterns, and environmental influences during development. Bone structure responds to mechanical stress, nutrition, and temperature exposure. Even subtle differences in childhood diet or disease burden can influence how facial bones grow and how features are expressed. Over generations, these influences can shift population averages without creating sharp boundaries. In colder climates, facial structures that reduce heat loss offered slight advantages. Narrower nasal passages can warm and humidify cold air before it reaches the lungs. Higher nasal bridges increase the surface area for this warming process. These traits are more common, on average, in populations whose ancestors lived in cold, dry environments for long periods. This does not mean every individual shares them, but the statistical pattern reflects environmental pressure. In warmer or more humid environments, those same traits offer no benefit and can even be disadvantageous. Wider nasal passages allow more efficient airflow and cooling. In regions where heat dissipation mattered more than heat retention, facial structures adjusted accordingly. These differences developed gradually, reinforced by repeated exposure to similar conditions across many generations. Eye shape is another feature often discussed and often oversimplified. The presence of epicanthic folds, more common in East Asian populations, is influenced by multiple factors. Cold exposure, fat distribution around the eyes, and protection from wind and glare may all have played roles. In cold or windy environments, additional tissue around the eyes can reduce exposure and irritation. Over time, such traits became more frequent in certain regions. Importantly, these features are not unique to one population. Epicanthic folds appear in many groups, including some indigenous populations in the Americas and Arctic regions. This reinforces the idea that similar environments can produce similar adaptations independently, a process known as convergent evolution. Body proportions also tell a long story. Humans living in cold climates tend to have shorter limbs relative to their torso. This reduces surface area and conserves heat. Those living in warm climates tend to have longer limbs, which increase surface area and aid cooling. These patterns, described by ecogeographical principles, appear across many species, not just humans. Europe, especially northern regions, experience prolonged cold exposure. Over time, populations there developed more compact body shapes on average. Asia, being more diverse in climate, shows a wider range of body proportions. Northern Asian populations share cold-adapted traits similar to those in Europe, while southern populations reflect adaptations to heat and humidity. Muscle distribution and bone density are also influenced by habitual activity. Daily survival tasks shape the body. Farming, hunting, foraging, and tool use all place different stresses on muscles and joints. In regions where rice farming dominated, repetitive lower body labour shaped strength and endurance patterns differently than in regions where large game hunting required bursts of upper body force. Nutrition during growth plays a critical role here. Protein-rich diets support different growth trajectories than carbohydrate-heavy ones. Childhood malnutrition or disease can stunt growth, alter proportions, and influence bone density. Over generations, consistent dietary patterns contribute to population-level differences in stature and build. It is crucial to emphasize that these are averages, not rules. There is immense variation within every population. Environmental effects during development can override genetic tendencies. A child of European ancestry raised in a warm, resource-rich environment may develop differently than one raised under harsher conditions. Biology responds to lived experience as much as to inherited potential. Skin, hair, and eye colour are often treated as defining features, but they too are adaptive responses rather than markers of deep separation. Skin pigmentation reflects UV exposure, as discussed earlier. Hair texture may influence heat retention or dissipation. Eye colour variation in Europe likely spread through a combination of reduced UV pressure and sexual selection, rather than direct survival advantage. Facial diversity also increases when populations are larger and more stable. In East Asia, long-term population continuity allowed a wide range of facial variation to persist. In Europe, repeated population bottlenecks reduced variation at times, amplifying certain traits through chance. These processes interact with selection but are not driven by it alone. Developmental timing matters as well. The age at which individuals reach maturity can influence body size and proportions. Climate, nutrition, and disease burden all affect maturation rates. In environments where childhood survival is uncertain, earlier maturation may offer reproductive advantages. In more stable environments, longer growth periods can support larger body size or different proportions. Faces and bodies also reflect social environments. Cultural practices influence posture, physical activity, and even facial muscle use. Over generations, habitual behaviours can subtly influence skeletal development. While these effects are modest compared to climate or diet, they contribute to the overall picture. One of the most persistent misunderstandings is the idea that visible differences imply deep biological divisions. In reality, the genetic differences underlying facial traits are small. Many of the same genes are shared across populations, expressed differently depending on context. A small change in gene regulation can alter appearance without altering underlying function. Evolution works by adjusting existing structures, not inventing new ones from scratch. Human faces follow the same basic plan everywhere. Eyes, nose, mouth, cheekbones and jaw are arranged in the same way. Differences lie in relative size, shape and tissue distribution, not in fundamental design. Bodies tell similar stories. All humans share the same skeletal structure. Variation reflects how that structure responds to environment over time. The differences are meaningful in context, but shallow in depth. They do not map neatly onto categories like intelligence, behavior, or capability. It is also worth noting that modern environments are changing these patterns rapidly. Globalization, improved nutrition, reduced disease burden, and interpopulation mixing are reshaping human bodies within a few generations. Average height has increased dramatically in many regions. Facial variation continues to blend. This reminds us that these traits are not fixed endpoints, but ongoing responses. When we look at faces and bodies as records of adaptation rather than symbols of division, they become evidence of a shared process. The same species encountered different challenges and responded using the same biological toolkit. The outcomes differ slightly, but the process is the same. Skin is often treated as something purely visual, a surface detail that separates people into categories at a glance. In reality, skin is one of the most complex and biologically active organs in the human body. It regulates temperature, protects against pathogens, manages water loss, produces vital compounds, and interacts continuously with the environment. When humans spread across Europe and Asia, skin became a frontline interface between biology and climate, responding not to identity or appearance, but to sunlight, temperature, and chemistry in ways that were slow, practical, and largely invisible. The most important environmental factor acting on skin is sunlight, specifically ultraviolet radiation. Ultraviolet light is neither purely harmful nor purely beneficial. In moderate amounts, it is essential. In excess, it is damaging. The balance between these two effects shapes skin biology more consistently than almost any other factor once humans left Africa. Ultraviolet radiation plays a critical role in the production of vitamin D. When UVB rays strike the skin, they trigger a chemical reaction that allows the body to synthesize vitamin D, which is essential for calcium absorption, bone health, immune function, and neurological processes. Without sufficient vitamin D, humans are at risk of weakened bones, compromised immunity, and developmental problems, particularly during childhood. In equatorial regions, ultraviolet radiation is intense and consistent year-round. Early humans evolved dark skin rich in melanin as protection. Melanin acts as a natural sunscreen, absorbing and dispersing UV radiation. This protects DNA from damage, reduces the risk of skin cancer, and prevents the breakdown of folate, a nutrient crucial for fetal development and sperm production. In high UV environments, dark skin is a clear survival advantage. As humans moved northward and eastward into Europe and large parts of Asia, sunlight conditions changed dramatically. UV intensity decreased with latitude, seasonal variation increased. In many regions, especially northern Europe, winters brought long periods with very little UV exposure at all. Under these conditions, dark skin became a disadvantage, not because it was harmful, but because it blocked too much UV radiation, limiting vitamin D production. Populations living under low UV conditions faced a chronic risk of vitamin D deficiency. Children with insufficient vitamin D can develop rickets, a condition that softens bones, leading to deformities and increased mortality. Adults may suffer from weakened bones, muscle pain, and immune dysfunction. Even small differences in vitamin D availability can affect reproductive success and survival over generations. In these environments, individuals with lighter skin, containing less melanin, were able to produce vitamin D more efficiently from limited sunlight. Over many generations, this advantage shifted population averages toward lighter pigmentation. This process did not happen all at once, and it did not happen uniformly. It occurred gradually, influenced by latitude, cloud cover, diet, and cultural practices. Diet played a moderating role. Populations that consumed vitamin D-rich foods, such as fatty fish or marine mammals, experienced less pressure to reduce skin pigmentation. This helps explain why some northern populations retain darker skin than latitude alone would predict. Skin adaptation always interacted with diet and lifestyle. Asia presents a more complex picture. Much of East Asia lies at latitudes that receive moderate UV exposure, but climate patterns, cloud cover, and seasonal monsoons alter sunlight availability. In these regions, extreme depigmentation was not as strongly favoured as in Northern Europe. Instead, a range of skin tones emerged, shaped by local conditions rather than a single directional trend. Additionally, clothing and shelter reduced direct sun exposure. In colder regions, heavy clothing limited UV exposure even further, increasing pressure for lighter skin. In warmer regions, clothing styles varied, sometimes increasing exposure, sometimes reducing it. These cultural factors influenced how much sunlight actually reached the skin, modifying biological pressures. Skin chemistry involves more than pigmentation. Sweat production, oil composition, and microbial communities all respond to environment. In warm, humid climates, efficient sweating is essential for thermoregulation. Sweat glands vary in activity, and skin blood flow patterns adjust to facilitate cooling. These traits influence dehydration risk and heat tolerance. In colder climates, sweating is less critical, but maintaining skin integrity against dryness becomes important. Cold air holds less moisture, increasing the risk of cracked skin and infection. Skin oil composition and barrier function adapt subtly to these conditions over time. The immune role of skin is often overlooked. Skin is a major immune organ, containing cells that detect pathogens and initiate responses. Local disease environments influence which immune strategies are most effective. In warm, wet regions with high pathogen loads, skin immunity faces constant challenges. In colder, drier regions, pathogen pressure is lower, shifting immune priorities. These differences influence gene variants related to inflammation, barrier function, and immune signaling. Many of these adaptations are invisible externally, but affect susceptibility to conditions like eczema, infections, and autoimmune responses. Skin also plays a role in circadian regulation. Sunlight exposure through the skin and eyes helps regulate hormonal cycles. Seasonal changes in light influence melatonin production, mood, and sleep patterns. Populations living under extreme seasonal light variation had to adjust biologically and behaviourally to long winters and bright summers. These adjustments affected mental health, activity patterns, and social organisation. Another invisible aspect of skin adaptation involves folate protection. Folate is sensitive to UV radiation. High UV exposure can degrade folate levels, increasing the risk of birth defects and reduce fertility. Darker skin protects folate by limiting UV penetration. In low UV environments, this protective function becomes less necessary, allowing pigmentation to decrease without reproductive cost. This balance between vitamin D synthesis and folate protection sits at the centre of skin evolution. Too much UV is harmful, too little UV is harmful. Skin pigmentation evolved to manage this trade-off under local conditions. There is no single optimal skin colour, only locally effective solutions. Hair and skin often evolve together. Hair coverage affects UV exposure and heat regulation. Thicker body hair provides insulation but limits sun exposure. Reduced body hair increases exposure but improves cooling. Human body hair reduction predates migration out of Africa, but regional differences in hair thickness and distribution may reflect later adjustments. It is important to emphasize that skin adaptation occurred independently in different regions. Light skin in Europe and lighter skin in East Asia arose through different genetic pathways. This is a key point. Similar appearances do not imply shared recent ancestry. They reflect similar pressures acting on different populations. Evolution often solves the same problem in multiple ways. Modern genetics confirms this. The genes influencing pigmentation in Europeans differ from those influencing pigmentation in East Asians. This underscores how flexible the human genome is. The same outcome can be achieved through different routes, depending on which genetic variants are available in a population. Skin differences are also among the most recent human adaptations. Many changes occurred within the last 20,000 years, coinciding with shifts in climate, diet, and settlement. This means that skin variation is shallow in evolutionary terms. It does not reflect deep divergence. It reflects recent fine-tuning. Children are particularly sensitive to skin-related adaptations. Childhood vitamin D levels influence skeletal development. Sun exposure during early life affects immune programming. These effects carry into adulthood, influencing survival and reproductive success. Over generations, this reinforces local skin adaptations. Cultural practices continue to shape skin biology. Modern clothing, indoor living, and dietary supplements alter UV exposure patterns dramatically. In many regions, vitamin D deficiency now occurs despite lighter skin, because lifestyles have changed faster than biology can respond. This highlights the ongoing interaction between culture and evolution. It also reminds us that skin colour is not destiny. It is a context-dependent trait shaped by environment. When environments change, mismatches can occur. These mismatches are biological, not moral or social. Misinterpretations of skin differences have caused immense harm historically. Assigning value or hierarchy based on pigmentation is not only unethical, it is biologically nonsensical. Skin variation reflects adaptation to sunlight, not intelligence, behaviour, or worth. Evolution does not encode social meaning into melanin. Understanding the chemistry behind skin adaptation dissolves many myths. It reveals a practical story about nutrients, radiation, and survival. A story shared by all humans, expressed differently depending on where ancestors lived. Cold winters and warm monsoons imposed very different rhythms on human life, and those rhythms mattered deeply because evolution is not only about extreme events, but about what happens repeatedly, predictably, year after year. When humans settled across Europe and Asia, the most persistent difference they encountered was not a single disaster or obstacle, but the way time itself unfolded through seasons. How long winters lasted, how reliable summers were, whether rain arrived gently, violently, or not at all. These patterns shaped bodies, behaviours, social organisation, and long-term survival strategies in ways that accumulated quietly across generations. In much of Europe, especially at higher latitudes, winter was the defining season. It arrived gradually, lingered for months, and imposed limits on almost every aspect of daily life. Temperatures dropped, daylight shortened dramatically, plant growth stopped, rivers froze or slowed, snow covered the ground, restricting movement and making travel dangerous. For early human populations, winter was not just uncomfortable. It was a prolonged survival challenge that had to be anticipated well in advance. Living under these conditions rewarded foresight. Food had to be secured before winter arrived. Hunting strategies shifted in autumn to focus on animals with the highest caloric return. Meat was dried or smoked. Fat was rendered and stored. Roots and grains were preserved where possible. Firewood was gathered in excess. Shelters were reinforced. Every decision made in warmer months carried consequences that might not be felt until much later. This created a strong selection pressure for planning behaviour. Groups that failed to prepare adequately faced starvation, exposure and death. Groups that coordinated effectively, shared resources, and enforced social rules around storage and distribution survived more reliably. Over time, this favoured psychological traits related to delayed gratification, memory, and rule adherence, not because they were morally superior, but because they improved winter survival. Cold winters also affected energy expenditure. Maintaining body temperature in cold environments requires constant caloric input. Humans living in these regions burned more energy simply staying warm, especially during sleep and periods of inactivity. This favoured metabolic strategies that could mobilise stored energy efficiently and conserve heat. Over generations, populations exposed to long winters developed tendencies toward energy storage and efficient thermoregulation. Daylight cycles added another layer. In northern Europe, winter days can be extremely short. Limited daylight constrained activity. Hunting and gathering became more difficult. Seasonal affective stress likely increased. Hormonal cycles tied to light exposure shifted, influencing sleep, mood, and reproductive timing. Humans had to adapt behaviourally and biologically to these prolonged periods of darkness. Fire and artificial light became crucial tools. Fire extended waking hours and provided warmth, but it also altered circadian rhythms. Exposure to firelight in winter may have helped stabilise daily schedules despite limited sunlight. Over time, populations adapted to these altered light environments through changes in hormone regulation and sleep patterns. By contrast, much of Asia, particularly South and East Asia, was shaped not by prolonged cold, but by monsoon systems. Monsoons are seasonal wind patterns that bring heavy rainfall during specific times of the year. Rather than months of frozen scarcity, these regions experienced cycles of abundance and excess. When monsoon rains arrived, fields flooded, rivers swelled, and crops thrived. When they failed, drought and famine followed. Living under monsoon climates required a different kind of planning. Timing mattered more than storage. Planting had to align precisely with rainfall. Flood management became essential. Communities had to coordinate irrigation, drainage, and labour on large scales. Success depended on collective action and shared schedules rather than individual stockpiling. Warm monsoon climates also placed different demands on the body. Heat and humidity challenge thermoregulation. Sweating becomes the primary cooling mechanism. Dehydration risk increases. Pathogens thrive in warm, wet conditions, increasing disease exposure. These pressures favoured physiological traits related to efficient sweating, electrolyte balance, and immune resilience. Unlike cold winters, which limit biological activity, monsoon seasons amplify it. Crops grow rapidly, insects proliferate, microbes flourish. This creates periods of intense labour followed by periods of relative rest. Human activity cycles became closely tied to rainfall patterns, shaping daily routines and annual calendars. Reproductive timing may also have been influenced. In some regions, births clustered around certain seasons, aligning childhood development with periods of food availability. This seasonal synchronization affects maternal health, infant survival, and population growth patterns over time. Cold winter environments, by contrast, often favoured births timed so that infants were not born during the harshest months. This influenced mating behaviour, social norms, and perhaps even hormonal cycles related to fertility. Disease pressures differed dramatically between these climates. Cold winters suppress many infectious diseases. pathogens struggle to survive freezing temperatures and low humidity. This reduces disease transmission during winter months, creating seasonal lulls. Warm monsoon climates, on the other hand, support year-round pathogen presence, with spikes during wet seasons. As a result, populations in monsoon regions faced constant immune challenges. Childhood exposure to parasites and infections was common. Immune systems adapted accordingly, favouring robust early responses. However, this also increased the risk of chronic inflammation and immune-related conditions, illustrating the trade-offs inherent in adaptation. Nutrition patterns reflected these seasonal differences. In cold climates, food intake often fluctuated sharply between seasons. Periods of abundance alternated with scarcity. Bodies adapted to tolerate fasting and rely on stored energy. In monsoon climates, food availability could be abundant but unpredictable. Crop failures due to flooding or drought introduced sudden shortages amid otherwise rich environments. These patterns influenced growth. Children in cold climates might experience slower growth during winter and catch-up growth in summer. In monsoon climates, disease burden during wet seasons could suppress growth despite adequate calories. Over generations, these developmental patterns shaped average body size and proportions. Social organisation responded as well. In cold regions, smaller, tightly bonded groups often proved more effective during winter isolation. In monsoon regions, large coordinated communities were advantageous for managing water and labour. These social structures influenced marriage patterns, inheritance systems, and conflict resolution, all of which indirectly affected gene flow and adaptation. Psychological rhythms also diverged. Long winters encouraged inward-focused activities, storytelling, tool-making, and planning. Warm monsoon environments encouraged outward activity, collective labour, and continuous interaction. These differences are not deterministic, but they influenced cultural traditions that persisted over time. Importantly, neither system was easier. Cold winters were brutal but predictable. Monsoons were productive but volatile. Each demanded different strategies. Humans did not become better or worse in response. They became suited to their circumstances. These seasonal rhythms also shaped how time was perceived. In winter-dominated climates, the year felt divided into stark phases. In monsoon climates, time revolved around cycles of rain and dryness. Calendars, rituals, and social expectations grew out of these patterns, reinforcing behavioural adaptations across generations. It is also crucial to remember that these climatic regimes were not static. Ice ages shifted winter severity. Monsoon strength fluctuated over millennia. Human populations had to adjust repeatedly, carrying forward adaptations shaped by previous conditions while responding to new ones. This layering of adaptations added complexity rather than replacing earlier traits outright. As environments changed, migration allowed some groups to escape unfavourable conditions, while others remained and adapted locally. This constant interplay between movement and adaptation prevented rigid specialisation while still allowing regional patterns to emerge. Cold winters and warm monsoons did not carve humanity into separate categories. They imposed different schedules on the same biological system. The differences that emerged were responses to timing, temperature, and predictability, expressed through physiology, behaviour, and culture. When humans began farming, something subtle but profound changed in the way time itself was experienced. Before agriculture, daily life revolved around immediate needs and short-term rhythms. Food was gathered or hunted when it was available. Movement followed animals, seasons, and landscapes. Time was flexible, local, and deeply tied to natural cues. Farming altered that relationship. It bound people to the land, synchronized their activities, and forced large groups to live according to shared schedules. In Europe and Asia, this shift unfolded differently, shaped by climate, crops, and geography, and it became one of the strongest forces guiding long-term divergence without ever breaking human unity. The transition to farming did not happen overnight, and it did not happen everywhere at once. In both Europe and Asia, It emerged gradually as people experimented with cultivating plants and managing animals. At first, farming supplemented foraging rather than replacing it. Over time, however, as techniques improved and populations grew, agriculture became central to survival. This transition tied human success more closely than ever to specific environments and seasonal patterns. In Europe, early agriculture developed under relatively challenging conditions: short growing seasons, unpredictable weather, and frequent cold spells limited which crops could thrive. Early farmers relied heavily on cereals like wheat and barley, along with domesticated animals such as cattle, sheep, and goats. Farming required clearing land, preparing soil, planting at the right moment, and harvesting before weather turned unfavourable. Mistiming any of these steps could mean failure. These constraints encouraged careful planning and coordination. Families and communities had to agree on planting schedules, share labour during peak periods, and manage stored food collectively. Agricultural success depended on cooperation across months, not just days. This reinforced social norms around responsibility, rule following, and shared obligation. In many parts of Asia, agriculture developed under different conditions. East Asia, particularly river valleys, offered fertile soils and predictable water cycles shaped by monsoons. Rice cultivation became dominant in many regions. Rice farming is uniquely demanding. It requires precise timing, constant water management, and intensive labour. Fields must be flooded, drained, and maintained carefully. A single household cannot manage this alone. As a result, rice agriculture strongly favoured collective organisation. Communities coordinated irrigation systems, synchronised planting and harvesting, and shared labour intensively. Success depended less on individual initiative and more on group harmony and timing. Over generations, this reinforced cultural patterns emphasising coordination, shared responsibility, and sensitivity to social rhythms. The physical demands of farming also differed. In Europe, ploughing fields and managing livestock required upper body strength and endurance, often favouring different labour divisions. In East Asia, rice cultivation placed heavy demands on lower body endurance, balance, and repetitive movement. These daily activities influenced musculoskeletal development over generations, especially when combined with childhood labour. Farming changed diet dramatically. In Europe, grain-based diets increased carbohydrate intake, but were often supplemented with dairy and meat. This supported certain metabolic adaptations, such as lactase persistence in some populations. In East Asia, rice became the dominant calorie source, often paired with vegetables and small amounts of protein. These diets shaped digestion, gut microbiomes, and energy regulation differently. Nutritional stability improved overall with farming, but it came at a cost. Reliance on a narrow range of crops increased vulnerability to famine. Crop failures could devastate entire communities. In Europe, cold snaps or excessive rain could wipe out harvests. In Asia, monsoon failure or flooding could do the same. These risks reinforced the importance of storage, trade, and social safety nets. As farming populations grew, settlements became permanent. Villages expanded into towns. Towns grew into cities. Permanent settlement changed human biology and culture in profound ways. High population density increased exposure to infectious diseases. Close contact with domesticated animals introduced new pathogens. Immune systems adapted under these pressures, favouring resistance to crowd-based diseases. Cities also changed social time. When thousands of people live together, individual schedules must align. Markets open at certain times. Labour begins and ends according to shared expectations. Religious rituals mark seasons. Administrative systems track taxation, storage, and distribution. Time becomes standardized within a community. In Europe, early cities developed gradually and often unevenly. Urban centres rose and fell with trade routes and political stability. In Asia, particularly East Asia, long-lasting bureaucratic states emerged earlier. maintaining continuous urban traditions over centuries. These systems reinforce standardized calendars, record-keeping and coordinated labor on large scales. Shared time reshaped daily life. People woke, worked, rested, and ate according to communal rhythms. This synchronization affected sleep patterns, stress responses, and social interactions. Living according to shared schedules required psychological flexibility and tolerance for delayed gratification. Children growing up in farming societies experienced different developmental pressures than those in foraging groups. Work began earlier. Diets were more repetitive. Disease exposure was higher. These factors influenced growth, maturation, and resilience. Over generations, these conditions shaped population-level tendencies without determining individual outcomes. Farming also altered movement patterns. Once tied to land, populations became more sedentary. Long-distance movement decreased for most people, though trade networks expanded. Reduced mobility increased local continuity, allowing regional traits to persist. At the same time, trade and conquest periodically reintroduced genetic and cultural mixing. The rise of cities amplified these effects. Urban centres attracted migrants, concentrating diversity while also exposing residents to intense selection pressures. Disease outbreaks were frequent. Sanitation was limited. Only those with certain immune resilience survived long-term urban living. This filtered populations in subtle ways. Social hierarchy emerged more strongly in farming societies. Control over land and food created inequality. Access to resources influenced survival and reproduction. These social structures affected who had children and how many, shaping genetic patterns over time. Importantly, agriculture did not make humans biologically superior or inferior. It changed the problems humans had to solve. Instead of tracking animals, people tracked seasons. Instead of moving away from scarcity, they endured it collectively. These shifts favoured different traits, both biological and cultural. Despite regional differences, farming created shared human experiences, waiting for crops to grow, worrying about weather, storing food for the future, organising labour. These experiences connected distant populations through similar challenges, even as solutions differed. Cities intensified this shared time further. Bells, markets, administrative deadlines, and later clocks structured daily life. Time became something measured and enforced rather than felt individually. This transformation laid the groundwork for later technological societies. As farming and cities reshaped human life, they layered new adaptations onto older ones shaped by climate, diet, and movement. None of these replaced what came before. They interacted, sometimes reinforcing, sometimes counteracting earlier patterns. Disease has always been one of the quietest and most powerful forces shaping human history. Unlike climate or terrain, it leaves no obvious marks on the landscape. Unlike tools or cities, it leaves no artifacts that can be easily excavated. Yet from the moment humans began living in larger, more stable groups, disease became a constant companion, shaping who survived, who reproduced, and which biological traits quietly persisted. As humans spread across Europe and Asia, differences in disease exposure and immune challenges became one of the most important drivers of subtle divergence, operating mostly out of sight, but never without consequence. Before large-scale settlement, infectious disease spread was limited by mobility. Small hunter-gatherer groups moved frequently, reducing prolonged exposure to pathogens. When disease did occur, it often burned out quickly because there were not enough hosts to sustain transmission. This changed dramatically once humans began settling, farming, and clustering together. Permanent settlements created the conditions pathogens thrive in. Dense populations, repeated contact, shared water sources, and close proximity to animals. Europe and Asia experienced this transition under very different ecological conditions. In much of Europe, colder climates limited the range and persistence of many pathogens. Winters interrupted transmission cycles. Freezing temperatures reduced parasite survival. Disease still existed, but it often followed seasonal patterns with outbreaks flaring and then subsiding. This created intermittent immune challenges rather than constant pressure. In large parts of Asia, especially South and Southeast Asia, warm temperatures and high humidity supported year-round pathogen presence. Bacteria, viruses, parasites, and fungi thrived in these environments. Standing water encouraged mosquito breeding. Soil supported helminths and other parasites. Food spoiled more quickly. Under these conditions, disease exposure was continuous rather than seasonal. This difference mattered profoundly. Immune systems respond to the threats they encounter most often. In regions with constant exposure, individuals with immune responses capable of early robust defense against a wide range of pathogens had a survival advantage, particularly in childhood. Over generations, this favored genetic variants associated with heightened immune vigilance and faster inflammatory responses. However, strong immune responses come with trade-offs. Chronic inflammation increases the risk of autoimmune conditions and tissue damage. In environments where pathogen exposure is lower or more intermittent, overly aggressive immune responses can be more harmful than helpful. This helps explain why immune-related conditions vary in prevalence across populations today. These differences are not flaws, they are legacies of different disease environments. One of the most important sources of new disease pressure came from domesticated animals. Farming brought humans into sustained contact with livestock. Many human infectious diseases originated as zoonoses, pathogens that jumped from animals to humans. Cattle, pigs, chickens, ducks, and other domesticated species all contributed to this process. The types of animals domesticated differed between regions. In Europe, cattle, sheep, and goats were common. In East and Southeast Asia, pigs, ducks, and chickens played larger roles. These differences shaped which zoonotic diseases emerged and persisted. Immune systems adapted locally to the disease landscapes created by these human-animal relationships. Urbanization amplified these pressures. Cities concentrated people and animals in close quarters. Waste management was limited. Water sources were easily contaminated. Epidemics became recurrent features of life. Survivorship in such environments depended heavily on immune resilience, particularly during childhood, when disease mortality was highest. Ancient encounters with other human populations also shaped immunity. When modern humans left Africa, they encountered Neanderthals and Denisovans, who had been living in Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years. These populations had already adapted immunologically to local pathogens. Interbreeding introduced immune-related genes that proved beneficial to modern humans. Genetic studies show that some Neanderthal-derived genes are involved in immune function, particularly those related to pathogen recognition and inflammatory response. These genes helped modern humans cope with Eurasian disease environments. However, some of these same genes are associated today with increased risk of autoimmune disorders, illustrating again the trade-offs inherent in adaptation. The distribution of these archaic genetic contributions differs between Europe and Asia. Europeans tend to carry more Neanderthal ancestry overall, while some Asian populations carry both Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry. These differences reflect patterns of ancient contact and migration, layered on top of local disease pressures. Pathogen diversity itself varied by region. Tropical and subtropical Asia hosted a wider range of parasites and vector-borne diseases than temperate Europe. Malaria, for example, exerted strong selective pressure in parts of Asia. Genetic adaptations affecting red blood cells and immune signaling arose in response. These adaptations can protect against malaria, but may increase susceptibility to other conditions. In Europe, diseases like tuberculosis, smallpox, and plague became dominant pressures later, particularly after urbanization intensified. Survivorship through repeated epidemics shaped immune profiles over centuries. The Black Death alone dramatically altered European population structure, killing a large proportion of the population and leaving survivors with genetic traits that influenced immune response. Disease also shaped social behaviour. Quarantine practices, burial customs, and hygiene norms emerged in response to repeated outbreaks. These cultural adaptations interacted with biology, reducing exposure and altering selection pressures. In some cases, cultural practices evolved faster than biological ones, buffering populations against disease. Childhood disease exposure was especially influential. Children who survived repeated infections developed immune memory that protected them later in life. Populations exposed to high childhood disease burdens adapted by favouring earlier immune development. This influenced growth patterns, energy allocation, and maturation timing. Nutrition interacted with immunity as well. Malnutrition weakens immune response. Disease impairs nutrient absorption. In regions where food availability fluctuated or diets lacked diversity, disease impacts were amplified. Over generations, this reinforced selection for immune efficiency under nutritional stress. Migration and trade continually reshaped disease landscapes. New pathogens arrived with travellers. Populations with no prior exposure suffered severe outbreaks. Over time, survivors passed on resistance. These cycles occurred repeatedly across Europe and Asia, ensuring that immune adaptation was never complete or static. Importantly, disease-driven adaptation did not produce visible external differences. Immune genes operate internally. Their effects are felt in survival rates, not appearance. This invisibility makes them easy to overlook, but their impact on population history is profound. Modern medicine has dramatically altered disease pressures, but the legacy remains. Differences in immune response, inflammation, and disease susceptibility reflect ancient environments rather than modern lifestyles. When populations move or environments change rapidly, mismatches can occur, leading to new health challenges. It is crucial to avoid misinterpreting these differences. Variation in immune traits does not imply strength or weakness in a moral sense. It reflects adaptation to specific historical conditions. A trait that offered protection in one environment may be neutral or harmful in another. Disease also reminds us of shared vulnerability. Pathogens do not respect boundaries. Throughout history, epidemics have crossed continents, linking distant populations through shared suffering and survival. These encounters reinforced human connectivity even as they shaped local adaptation. As humans continued to live alongside disease, they developed cultural strategies alongside biological ones. Herbal medicine, sanitation practices, social distancing rituals, and later institutional healthcare all emerged from repeated encounters with illness. These strategies further shaped survival patterns and population structure. The story of disease and immunity is not one of separation, but of interaction. Humans adapted not only to their environments, but to each other, to animals, and to microscopic life. These interactions left marks deep within biology, invisible but enduring. As the exploration moves forward, attention will turn to how culture itself became an evolutionary force. Beliefs, practices, social norms, and shared knowledge began to influence survival as much as climate or disease ever did, adding another layer to the long process through which one species expressed itself differently across Europe and Asia. Culture did not arrive after evolution finished. It became part of the process while evolution was still very much underway. Once humans developed the ability to learn extensively from one another, to transmit knowledge across generations, and to shape their environments deliberately, culture stopped being a background feature of life and became an active force influencing survival. In Europe and Asia, culture did not simply reflect biological differences. It interacted with biology continuously, redirecting pressures, amplifying some traits, softening others, and sometimes creating entirely new challenges that bodies had to respond to over time. One of the most important things to understand about culture is that it changes much faster than biology. Genetic evolution operates across many generations. cultural evolution can occur within a single lifetime. A new tool, farming method, social rule, or belief can spread quickly if it proves useful. This difference in speed matters, because it means culture often reshapes the environment faster than biology can adapt, creating feedback loops that influence which traits persist. When humans began wearing tailored clothing, for example, they reduced direct exposure to cold. This softened selection pressure on biological cold tolerance. Traits that once mattered deeply became less critical. However, this did not remove pressure entirely, it redirected it. People now depended on access to materials, skills, and social networks to survive winter. Cultural competence became as important as physical traits. In Europe, repeated cold exposure encouraged cultural innovations focused on insulation, shelter, and storage. Thick clothing, enclosed dwellings, and hearth-centered living became standard. These practices reduced mortality from exposure, but increased dependence on cooperative systems. Individuals who could not integrate socially or contribute to group efforts faced greater risk. Over time, this favored social traits related to cooperation, conformity, and shared responsibility, not as abstract values, but as survival mechanisms. In large parts of Asia, particularly East Asia, cultural evolution emphasized coordination at scale. Rice agriculture, flood control, and irrigation systems required precise timing and collective effort. Individual success was tightly linked to group success. Cultural norms emphasizing harmony, role adherence, and mutual obligation were not philosophical inventions. They were practical responses to environmental demands. These norms influenced daily behavior, stress responses, and social expectations. Children raised in such systems learned early to attune to others, anticipate collective needs, and suppress actions that disrupted coordination. Over generations, these behavioral patterns interacted with biology, influencing hormone regulation, stress physiology, and even patterns of emotional expression. Language itself became an evolutionary tool. Communication allows humans to share information without direct experience. Knowledge about seasons, food sources, danger, and social rules can be transmitted quickly and accurately. Regions with dense populations and long-term settlement developed complex languages capable of conveying nuanced instructions and abstract concepts. These linguistic systems supported cultural complexity and reinforced social cohesion. Language also shapes thought patterns. The way time, responsibility, and relationships are expressed linguistically influences perception and behavior. These influences do not create biological differences directly, but they shape developmental environments. Over generations, consistent developmental patterns interact with biology, influencing stress resilience, cognitive focus, and social behavior. Marriage practices are another powerful cultural force. Rules about who can marry whom determine gene flow. Endogamous practices, where marriage occurs within a group, reinforce local genetic patterns. Exogamous practices, where marriage occurs across groups, increase mixing. Europe and Asia developed different marriage norms in different regions, influenced by land inheritance, social structure, and economic strategy. In some European farming societies, land inheritance encouraged marrying within certain boundaries to keep property intact. In some Asian societies, clan-based systems shaped marriage networks differently. These practices influenced population structure without any biological intention. Over time, they contributed to regional differentiation. Dietary culture also acted as an evolutionary force. Food preferences are learned, shared, and enforced culturally. Once a population adopts a staple food, biological systems may gradually adjust to process it efficiently. Lactase persistence in some European populations is a clear example. Cultural dairy consumption created a selective environment favouring lactose digestion into adulthood. In East Asia, widespread dairy consumption did not occur historically, so there was no similar pressure. This does not reflect intolerance or deficiency. It reflects cultural history shaping biological outcomes. Culture set the stage. biology responded. Cultural attitudes toward illness and care also influenced survival. Societies that developed effective caregiving practices improved survival rates for the sick and injured. This allowed individuals with traits that might otherwise reduce survival to live and reproduce. In this way, culture relaxed certain selective pressures, increasing biological diversity. However, culture could also intensify pressure. Social hierarchies determined access to food, protection, and mates. In stratified societies, lower status individuals experienced higher mortality and lower reproductive success. These patterns influenced which traits persisted, even though the driving force was social rather than environmental. Belief systems mattered as well. Rituals, taboos, and moral codes regulated behavior. Some reduced disease transmission, such as food preparation rules or burial practices. Others increased risk, such as dietary restrictions during famine. Beliefs that improved group survival tended to persist, not because they were biologically encoded, but because groups practicing them endured. Time perception changed through culture. Agricultural societies organized life around calendars. Religious festivals marked seasons. Work schedules structured days. This synchronization altered stress patterns and sleep cycles. Humans adapted to these shared rhythms behaviorally and physiologically. Education became another cultural adaptation. Teaching children skills early increased survival. Societies that invested in long childhood learning periods benefited from more skilled adults. This reinforced extended development periods, a biological trait already present in humans. Culture amplified it. Importantly, cultural evolution did not move uniformly. Europe experienced periods of fragmentation, where cultural systems collapsed and reformed. Asia, particularly East Asia, maintained longer continuous cultural traditions in some regions. These differences influenced stability, innovation rates, and population continuity. Despite these differences, culture did not replace biology. It interacted with it constantly. When cultural practices changed faster than biology could adapt, mismatches occurred. These mismatches produced new pressures, new adaptations, and sometimes new problems. Modern examples illustrate this clearly. Industrialization changed diet, movement, and social structure rapidly. Biological systems adapted for earlier environments now struggle with sedentary lifestyles and calorie abundance. These issues are not failures of evolution. They are signs of how deeply culture now shapes human environments. Looking back, it becomes clear that many differences between Europeans and Asians cannot be understood through biology alone. Cultural systems shape survival so effectively that they became evolutionary forces in their own right. They determined who thrived, who struggled, and how populations responded to change. Culture also preserved diversity. Different solutions to similar problems emerged and persisted. There was no single optimal way to be human. Multiple strategies worked depending on context. This diversity strengthened the species as a whole. When people hear that Europeans and Asians evolved differently, it is very easy for the idea to drift in the wrong direction. History shows this clearly. Misunderstandings about evolution have repeatedly been used to justify false hierarchies, rigid categories, and harmful beliefs about human value. These ideas did not come from biology itself. They came from misreading biology through social, political, and emotional lenses. To understand what evolution actually tells us, it is just as important to understand what it does not say. One of the most persistent myths is that evolution is a ladder, with some groups higher and others lower. This image is intuitive but wrong. Evolution does not move upward toward improvement. It does not aim at intelligence, morality, or complexity. It responds to local conditions. A trait that is useful in one environment may be neutral or harmful in another. There is no universal scale on which all humans can be ranked. This misunderstanding often begins with the language people use. Words like advanced, primitive, developed, or backward sound descriptive, but they quietly imply judgment. In evolutionary terms, these labels are meaningless. All modern humans are equally evolved. Every population alive today has undergone the same amount of evolutionary time. There are no living fossils among humans, and there are no populations that stopped evolving while others continued. Another common myth is that visible differences reflect deep biological divisions. Skin color, facial features, and body proportions are highly noticeable, so people assume they must represent major genetic differences. In reality, these traits are controlled by a small number of genes and are strongly influenced by environment. They sit on the surface of human variation, not at its core. Genetically, humans are remarkably similar. The vast majority of genetic variation exists within populations, not between them. Two people from the same village can be more genetically different from each other than two people from opposite ends of Eurasia. This makes rigid racial categories biologically incoherent, even if they persist socially. Another misconception is that evolution produces fixed traits that define destiny. People often assume that if a trait evolved in a population, it must determine behavior, intelligence, or ability today. This ignores how flexible human biology is. Genes influence tendencies, not outcomes. Environment, culture, education, nutrition, and individual experience all interact with biology continuously. For example, differences in average height between populations are often attributed to genetics alone. In reality, nutrition, disease exposure, and childhood conditions play enormous roles. When environmental conditions improve, height changes rapidly within just a few generations. This demonstrates how quickly biological expression responds to context. The same applies to cognitive traits. Intelligence is not a single biological attribute that can be ranked across populations. It is a complex set of abilities influenced by education, culture, language, nutrition, and social opportunity. Evolution does not assign intelligence to climates or continents. It equips humans with flexible brains capable of learning from their environments. Another damaging myth is that evolution favors competition over cooperation. This idea has been used to justify social inequality and exploitation, often under the banner of survival of the fittest. In reality, human evolution is deeply rooted in cooperation. Groups that shared food, protected one another, and coordinated care for children and the injured survived more reliably than those that did not. Fitness in evolutionary terms means reproductive success within a given environment, not strength, dominance, or cruelty. In many contexts, empathy, communication, and trust are far more adaptive than aggression. Different environments favour different balances between competition and cooperation, but neither exists in isolation. Misunderstandings also arise from confusing correlation with cause. When people observe cultural differences between regions, they may assume those differences are biologically determined. This ignores how culture itself evolves, often independently of genetics. Writing systems, philosophies, technologies, and social norms spread through learning, not DNA. Agriculture, for example, transformed societies across Europe and Asia in different ways, but not because people were biologically predisposed to farm differently. They responded to local crops, climates, and histories. Cultural solutions emerged where they were useful, not where genes demanded them. Another myth is that evolution stopped in the past. Some imagine that adaptation happened long ago, and that modern humans are static. In reality, evolution is ongoing. Changes in diet, disease exposure, urbanization, and technology continue to shape human biology. Lactase persistence, disease resistance, and metabolic traits have all changed within the last few thousand years. At the same time, modern culture now changes environments faster than biology can keep up. This creates mismatches. Bodies adapted for scarcity now face abundance. Immune systems shaped by high pathogen exposure now encounter sanitized environments. These mismatches cause health challenges. but they do not imply failure. They reflect rapid change. Another persistent misunderstanding involves the idea of purity. Some people imagine populations as genetically pure until disrupted by mixing. This has never been true. Human history is one of constant movement and interbreeding. From the moment humans left Africa, they mixed with other populations, including Neanderthals and Denisovans. Later migrations layered diversity on top of diversity. There is no original, unmixed version of any population. Every group is the result of countless encounters, movements, and exchanges. Attempting to trace a single pure lineage misunderstands how populations actually form. Evolution is also often mistaken for justification. People assume that because something evolved, it must be good, right, or inevitable. This is a logical error known as the naturalistic fallacy. Evolution explains how traits arise, not how humans should behave. Violence, cooperation, inequality, and compassion all have evolutionary roots, but that does not make any of them morally acceptable or unacceptable by default. Understanding evolution should increase humility, not certainty. It shows how contingent human history is. Small changes in climate, geography, or chance events could have produced different outcomes. The traits common in any population today are not destiny fulfilled. They are one of many possible paths that happen to work well enough to persist. It is also important to recognize how scientific ideas can be distorted by social context. In the past, evolutionary theory was misused to support colonialism, racism, and eugenics. These abuses were not rooted in evolutionary biology itself, but in social agendas that cherry-picked or misrepresented science. Modern biology explicitly rejects these interpretations. Contemporary genetics reinforces this rejection. It shows continuous variation, shared ancestry, and overlapping traits across all human populations. It undermines simplistic categories and emphasizes connection over division. When people ask why Europeans and Asians evolved differently, the most accurate answer is that they adapted locally to different conditions while remaining fully human and fully connected. There is no hidden ranking, no biological destiny, no inherent superiority encoded in DNA. There are only responses to environment, filtered through time. Another misunderstanding is assuming that adaptation implies optimization. Evolution produces workable solutions, not perfect ones. Many traits persist despite trade-offs and limitations. The human spine, for example, is poorly suited for upright posture, yet it works well enough. Skin adaptations balance vitamin production and protection imperfectly. Immune systems trade resistance for inflammation. None of these outcomes are ideal. They are compromises. Recognizing this helps dismantle the idea that some populations are better designed than others. All humans carry vulnerabilities shaped by their histories. Different environments highlight different weaknesses and strengths. Evolution also does not explain everything. Human behavior is influenced by conscious choice, learning, and ethics. Biology provides capacities, not instructions. Culture, reflection, and cooperation allow humans to transcend some biological tendencies when necessary. Understanding what evolution is not allows a clearer view of what it is. It is a descriptive framework for understanding change over time. It explains patterns, not purposes. It traces pathways, not values. As this exploration continues, it becomes clear that the differences between populations are meaningful without being divisive. They tell stories about ice and monsoons, food and fire, disease and cooperation. They reveal how flexible and resilient humans are as a species. When all the layers are laid out side by side, climate, food, movement, disease, culture, bodies and beliefs, what becomes clear is not how divided humans are, but how unfinished we remain. The story of human evolution does not end with Europeans on one side of a map and Asians on the other. It does not conclude with visible differences, cultural traditions, or historical paths. It continues, quietly and constantly, and every generation that lives adapts, learns and responds to a world that never stays still for very long. The most important thing to understand about human evolution is that it is not something that happened to other people in the distant past. It is something that is still happening now. Not in dramatic leaps, not in obvious transformations, but in small shifts that accumulate slowly. Bodies respond to environments, immune systems adjust to new disease landscapes, metabolism adapts to changing diets, even patterns of growth and development shift as conditions change. Humans are not a finished product. We are an ongoing process. What we call Europeans and Asians today are not endpoints of separate journeys. They are temporary labels attached to populations that have been in motion for tens of thousands of years. The ancestors of people living in Europe today pass through Asia. The ancestors of people living in Asia today pass through regions that no longer exist in the same form. Sea levels rose, ice retreated, forests expanded, grasslands disappeared. Rivers changed course. Human paths crossed and recrossed repeatedly. At no point did humanity split into sealed compartments. There were moments of isolation, yes. There were periods where contact slowed. But isolation was never absolute, and it was never permanent. Even small amounts of movement are enough to keep populations connected. Even rare encounters are enough to blur boundaries over time. The shared ancestry of all humans remains written into every genome. This matters because it reframes difference. Differences are not signs of separation. They are records of experience. They show where ancestors lived, what challenges they faced, and how they solved everyday problems well enough to survive. They are not instructions for how people should live now, nor are they measures of worth. They are historical traces, not verdicts. One of the most striking lessons from evolutionary biology is how much humans share despite surface variation. The genetic differences between populations are tiny compared to what is shared. The same organs, the same biochemical pathways, the same developmental processes operate in every human body. When a heart beats, it beats the same way. When bones grow, they follow the same blueprint. When neurons fire, they obey the same rules. Even traits that look very different on the surface often arise from small changes in timing or regulation rather than entirely different structures. A slight shift in gene expression during development can alter facial shape. A modest change in enzyme activity can affect digestion. A subtle adjustment in immune signaling can influence disease response. These are variations on a shared theme, not separate designs. Culture reinforces this shared story as much as biology does. Humans everywhere tell stories, care for children, mourn the dead, mark time, and seek meaning. These behaviors appear in different forms, shaped by history and environment, but the underlying impulses are universal. Cooperation, learning, curiosity, and social bonding are not European traits or Asian traits. They are human traits. The fact that culture became an evolutionary force itself highlights this unity. Culture allowed humans to adapt faster than biology alone would allow. It enabled survival in environments that bodies alone could not handle. It allowed groups to transmit solutions across generations without waiting for genetic change. This capacity did not arise differently in different regions. It arose once and spread everywhere. As culture accelerated, it began to reshape environments more rapidly than natural forces ever had. Agriculture transformed landscapes. Cities concentrated populations. Technology altered diets, movement, and exposure to disease. These changes happened in Europe and Asia at different times, and in different ways, but they followed similar patterns. Humans altered their surroundings, then adapted to the consequences. In the modern world, this process has intensified. Global trade, rapid travel, and digital communication have collapsed distances that once shaped evolution. People move across continents within hours. Diets change within decades. Disease landscapes shift quickly. Cultural practices spread globally. This creates new pressures and new mismatches between bodies shaped by the past and environments shaped by the present. Many modern health challenges reflect this mismatch. Metabolic disorders, autoimmune conditions, sleep disruption, and stress-related illnesses often arise because biological systems adapted for one set of conditions are now operating in another. These issues appear across populations, though their prevalence varies depending on historical adaptations. Again, these differences reflect past environments, not inherent strengths or weaknesses. The idea that humans are still becoming is important because it removes the illusion of finality. There is no ideal human form. There is no end point toward which evolution is moving. There are only shifting conditions and ongoing responses. What works now may not work later. What once offered an advantage may become a liability. This has always been true. It also means that the future of human diversity is open. As environments change, as populations mix, and as cultures evolve, patterns will shift again. Some differences will fade. New ones may emerge. The categories people rely on today may lose meaning, replaced by new ways of describing variation. This does not erase history. The past still matters. The adaptations shaped by ice, forests, monsoons and disease remain written into bodies and genomes. But they do not dictate what comes next. Humans have an unusual ability to reshape their environments deliberately, to reflect on their choices, and to act collectively. This ability allows for outcomes that evolution alone could not predict. Understanding this shared story also carries responsibility. When differences are understood as adaptations rather than hierarchies, it becomes harder to justify exclusion or harm. When variation is seen as a resource rather than a threat, cooperation becomes easier. Evolutionary knowledge does not tell humans how to behave, but it can inform more thoughtful choices. The story of divergence is incomplete without the story of reconnection. Migration continues. Intermarriage continues. Cultural exchange accelerates. These processes are not new. They are simply happening at unprecedented speed. The same mechanisms that once produced regional variation now produce blending and recombination. This does not mean diversity will disappear. Variation will always exist, because environments will always differ, and because chance will always play a role. But the nature of that diversity will change. It will be shaped less by geography and more by shared global systems, local conditions, and individual choices. Looking back across the long arc of human history, the most striking feature is not how different humans became, but how adaptable they proved to be. Faced with ice ages, monsoons, famine, disease, and uncertainty, humans persisted. They learned. They cooperated. They modified their behavior. They carried forward knowledge as well as genes. Europeans and Asians did not evolve along separate tracks. They travelled overlapping routes through different landscapes at different times. The differences that emerged are meaningful, but they are not boundaries. They are evidence of flexibility, not division. And even now, the story is unfinished. New environments are forming. New challenges are emerging. New cultural tools are being invented. Bodies and minds are responding in ways that will only become clear long after the present moment has passed. So when we ask why humans evolve differently across regions, the most complete answer is also the simplest. Humans responded to where they were, with what they had, for as long as they needed to. They are still doing that now. The details change, the context shifts, but the process continues. We are not products of a completed past. We are participants in an ongoing one, still becoming, together, shaped by shared origins and diverging paths that never truly stop intersecting, carried forward by time, environment, and the quiet, persistent act of living.